Suraj is from Harvard, and we have our first auditor paper today, Auditor Quality and Auditor Reputation, Evidence from Japan. Now, we're a little bit behind time, so we try to constrain some of the questions during the presentation. Questions for clarification we can take, but we'll try and leave question time for more for the end because we're running a little bit on time, and they'd like us to come in for dinner around about 6 o'clock. Okay.
The paper essentially is so Doug Skinner, who's my co-author and was my colleague at Chicago, he's worked on quite a few projects, sort of based out of Japan, based in the Japanese context, because there are very, very interesting questions that you can answer once sort of you extend the institutional variation than just looking at the United States, where most of the papers, at least in this literature, has been set. And I've been interested in, and I was doing a project on Japanese governance, and also I've sort of worked in reputation of governance intermediaries before, so this seemed like a very, very interesting setting for us to start thinking about, and in the context of in the context of auditor reputation question. So reputation, in some sense, is the market's way of rewarding or penalizing good or poor performance, and the litigation being the sort of the regulatory way of doing the same thing. So the event that we use here to understand auditor reputation is something like the sort of the Enron scandal in Japan in terms of the sort of the magnitude of what happened there. So what happened was is that Chuo Aoyama, and that's the last time I'll try to say the whole name of the PwC affiliate. So PwC, which operated through Chuo in Japan, was just like Anderson was in Enron's case, was implicated in a scandal with a company called Kunibo. It was a pretty big deal, and the auditors were arrested after they were searched. PwC, which, as you all know, it's one of the largest firms in the world. Japan is the world's second largest economy, and large firms are are in a market share strategy, a maximizing market share strategy around the world. PwC reacted in a very different way in Japan, which is actually what got us started out on this question. They reacted very atypically to the strategy of any large audit firm around the world. They decided to shrink. They decided to adopt sort of a niche positioning where they would keep only high-quality clients. And from being a large part of the market with over 1,000 clients, over 1,000 audit partners, shrank to about 50 firms and about 50 or so audit partners, and adopted a completely different strategy from any large audit firm anywhere in the world. And that itself sort of has some lessons, we think, on how audit firms can start thinking about their sort of reputational role or their role as a intermediary in the audit profession. So PwC, as the fraud got revealed and some other incidents of problems with Chuo's clients, forced the firm to close. So prior research has tried to understand this question about what motivates auditors to do a good job, and there are typically two sort of notions that people think of here. One is, if you don't do a good job, you'll get sued, and to the extent that and if those claims are and the larger the audit firm, the deeper its pockets, and therefore investors would like large audit firms to audit the companies that they invest in. And auditors don't want to get sued and they don't want to lose money due to bad audits, and that would provide an incentive for them, sort of ex-ante incentive for them to do good audits. The other rationale is sort of more a market-based idea that you develop a reputation for providing high-quality audits, and because of that, you can extract rents from the audits that you do. And so the premium fee that you charge will depend upon where you rank in this sort of reputational spectrum, and audit firms will therefore provide better quality audits to be able to demand these rents. Both these effects, both the litigation insurance effect and the reputation effect, predict that larger audit firms are more likely to deliver better audit quality. The larger you are, the more liable you could be for litigation claims. The larger you are, the more you can extract from sort of reputational gains. On the first point, on this liability point, it's been a very, very controversial issue ever since, even before Andersen's sort of implosion, but especially after that. Now that 5 large firms became 4, there's been a huge sort of a political demand by the larger audit firms for capping their liabilities. In fact, there's presently a commission that the U.S. Secretary of Treasury started to advise the SEC and the U.S. government on what to do if there is further catastrophic claims against auditors. And in Europe, there is a move to have some caps on liability, because even currently, if you just add up all the claims against the large audit firms, that's far more than anything that they can sustain. If these things go through, we're not going to have any of the big 4 auditors left. So consequently, the audit firms want strict limits on liability, and this is getting serious attention. So what happens if there is one more such Enron kind of problem, and one of the big 4 auditors is forced to go, is forced to close down? What's going to happen? One view is it doesn't matter, the market will take care of it. One of the other smaller firms will be able to pick up business, will be able to grow. Firms might merge. Various things might happen. It so happens that exactly that same scenario played out in Japan. There is no big 4. It is a big 3 plus a different PricewaterhouseCoopers in Japan. So to the extent that catastrophic claims is a serious problem, Japan provides an example of how the scenario might play out if something like that happens elsewhere in the world. So what happens if another big 4 gets eliminated? And at least descriptively, we can see from Japan what happened when a similar problem happened. And the second sort of question, so that's sort of a descriptive understanding of what might happen if there is a catastrophic claim. Or in the Japanese case, it wasn't a catastrophic claim, rather just a catastrophic event that led Pricewaterhouse to shrink. And the second thing that we're trying to do here is, does reputation matter in the audit industry? There has been papers which have tried to explore this issue. The problem is you don't have serious problems with large audit firms on a regular basis. So, and whenever these things happen, there are other events which might, other things going on, other constraints on the data which might prevent us from understanding the issues very, very clearly. For example, if you want to use Enron and Andersen's case to understand auditor reputation and audit quality issues, one problem is that the implosion happened so quickly. In 3 months, it went from Andersen being large to Andersen being non-existent. This doesn't give enough scope to try to actually understand how events played out. One of the advantages in this setting was that it played out over a long period of time, which gives us enough time series data to understand how companies responded throughout the process. So a similar study with Joe Weber and colleagues did was set in Germany, and the similarity is that when we're trying to understand the insurance and the reputational rationale, if you set it in the US, where both the motives are present, it's very, very hard to disentangle those. How much does reputation matter to audit firms versus how much does the insurance/litigation rationale matter to audit firms? So one of the things that paper did was, because it was set in Germany, where the litigation against auditors is very, very limited, they could try to get a sense of how much the reputational effect was. Unfortunately, one of the issues with that paper was that the event itself wasn't, it was a fairly reasonable event to examine, but it wasn't what I might call sort of an Enron type event that to understand sort of economic effects from that might have been an issue. So ours is sort of a similar setting to the Weber paper, which was set in Germany. One contrast being that the event is much larger sort of economic magnitude. So this was, for Japan, a very, very unusual step in the way the whole story played out, and we'll go through a little bit of how the whole story played out. Pricewaterhouse was forced to suspend its activities for about 2 months, which was a slap on the wrist, but the Japanese government, after seeing how Anderson situation had played out in the US, did not want to precipitate elimination of an audit firm in Japan. And what that allowed PwC to do is sort of step back and try to understand and then try to decide what they wanted to do. One of the things we've done, and this is the fascinating part for me in this paper, that we've got a chance to talk to a lot of these people in PwC and outside who were involved at sort of various stages of this process. One of these people we've talked to is sort of the global quality control head for PwC, and he was the person who was sent to Japan to fix the problem once the sort of government was getting serious about PwC. And so we've gotten some insight into the various steps that PwC had to go through. One of the and sort of the unusual thing that PwC did was to protect its reputation, decide to cut back and become a niche player. And the suspension was a credible signal from regulators in Japan that they are getting very serious about financial reporting. In the paper, we have gone into some length trying to describe the financial reporting environment in Japan, how it evolved and why it is the way it is, and a very sort of simple way of characterizing it would be it's sort of non sort of Western US UK model. It's not a confrontational relationship with the auditor manager relationship is not a confrontational one. It's much more cozier kind of relationship. And one of the goals of the Japanese regulators was to use this shock to make it a little more arm's length. Previously, I mean, this is auditor reputation and its impact on audit quality has been of interest to accounting academics for quite a long time. And the idea has been to look at when firms switch auditors and examine cross-sectional variation in that. So, Lennox in 1999 examines audit failures in the UK for about a 7-year period, and actually finds very little evidence that when audit firms are seen to be providing low-quality audits, that the clients don't seem to care. Audit firm has a big financial reporting restatement or something like that happens with one of their clients. Rest of their clients don't seem to really react to this revelation of low-quality auditing. Weber, on the other hand, does find some evidence that when KPMG was involved with Comroad, some of the clients switched away. So it's not been, and there are some other papers which have looked at this. Is not by any means a completely exhaustive list. Just to illustrate that it's not very clear how much clients, what's the sort of the demand for high quality auditing from the clients. To get at a similar issue, Barton looks at the timing of switches away from Anderson. after the problems at Enron were revealed, and that finds that a huge amount of switching happened after the indictment. And the problem with this, as I just mentioned, was that it happened in such a short period of time, and it was basically, people were rushing to the door as soon as Anderson's problems were evident, because it was a question of who gets out first, and you got to go out and get a new auditor. It was very clear Anderson was going to implode very quickly. So Anderson's event really doesn't allow a very careful examination of what would have happened if the government hadn't reacted the way it did for Anderson. Jennifer Bloin and her co-authors looked at what happened to Anderson's clients after Anderson imploded. Where did they go? And tried to examine whether the new auditor that takes Anderson's clients, what is the decision process they undertake to pick clients? So are they going to avoid the riskier clients? Are they going to take the more remunerative clients, and so on and so forth, and find some evidence that that auditors avoid more riskier clients. There's a sort of an earlier literature on one of the big bankruptcies that happened with an auditor in the U.S., the Leventhal and Horvath, and both these studies found basically that as this bankruptcy unraveled or evolved, there were negative reaction to the clients, which says that it is important to have a good quality auditor, but it couldn't interpret the insurance versus reputational issues, because it's based in the U.S. Both these are present, and what this did say was auditing is important, audit quality is important. When you have to switch auditors, there's a switching cost, and when the auditor goes bankrupt, the investors cannot go in and make claims against the auditor who doesn't exist anymore. So while this does show that these effects are important, it doesn't let you separate out what the relative economic importance of these different effects is. There is research on Anderson's role. So Cheney and Filipich find when the Anderson and Enron-related events, as they evolved, there was negative client stock price reaction. There's a recent paper in JEE which actually questions this and finds that there were other events, oil price shocks during this time period, and because most of the negative reaction was from Houston-based clients, most of which were also oil industry-related companies, you cannot actually tell what caused the negative reaction. Was it Enron-related events, or was it sort of oil price-related events which caused these negative reactions? So again, there is a negative reaction to Anderson-related events, but you can't really tell why, because there are other sort of contemporaneous events going on. Joe Weber's paper found in Germany that there are negative stock price reactions. So there is some research out there. Auditor catastrophes don't happen every day. So one thing that that sort of looking worldwide helps us is to identify more such events, so that across these different institutional environments, one can try to understand the auditor reputation phenomenon better. So what's the sort of the Japanese setting? Sort of loosely characterizing for the last 50 years or so, Japan has been the industrial structure in Japan has evolved around the Keiretsu structure. So these are large groups with strong intra-group relationships, large bank holdings, a lot of intergroup transactions. Auditors for these group companies are typically the same. Financing, the economy was much more debt-based than equity-based. The major Japanese banks were center of these Keiretsu groupings. And so this was in some sense an alternative to an arm's length capital market based financing structure. Banks would give debt, they would have their representatives on the board, they would have much more information, and this was a way of filling in sort of the institutional voids which are which are sort of filled by capital market intermediaries in a Western economy or in a more capital market-based economy or in a more equity market-based economy. So the Japanese financial system, I think sort of would be okay to characterize it as operating differently from let's say a US financial system. And one of these differences that that one would need to keep in mind as you understand the role of auditors is that the financial reporting system is not just tuned towards debt and equity holders. It is also the other stakeholders are also very, very important. Over the 1990s, which has been characterized by many commentators as the lost decade, in the sense that the Japanese economy basically did not grow in the 90s at all. One of the important things that the government tried to do was to reform the financial sector, and a large part of that was reforming the financial reporting environment to kickstart the Japanese economy. And so our events are sort of set in this background. That the Japanese, and the other thing that was happening is that Japan is not yet adopted the IFRS, and they're trying to present their auditing system and their financial reporting system as of comparable quality. And when something like this hits, serious questions are asked about the quality of auditing, forces the regulators to really sort of step up and change the auditor-client relationship. So the question we are asking here is basically to try to understand what was the role, what are the various things that happen, and how does that inform us about auditor reputation and audit quality. First question, where Chuo, Ioma's, or Pricewaterhouse clients systematically different. So one of the things, to give you a sense, this was a pretty big deal in Japan. There have been 3 books written on this. One of which is like a paperback novel kind of thing on who were the players and what they were doing and all that. And so one of the allegations or comments is PwC in Japan was systematically a bad auditor, in the sense that they took on the riskier clients, they allowed those riskier clients to do risky things, and they really weren't doing their job too well. So the first question, sort of naturally, when you start getting into this, is that true? Is it true that Pricewaterhouse was systematically a poor quality auditor in Japan? 2, as the events sort of unfolded, can we see evidence that clients value audit quality? And through that, can we figure out cross-sectionally which clients value audit quality more than others? Did clients switch away from Chuo when quality was called into question? And can cross-sectional variation in the switching decision be used to explain, can it be explained as a function of audit quality? And finally, can we use stock price reaction to these various events to, again, try to understand how the market, how investors value audit quality? So this is sort of the set of questions that we'll try to run through in the paper. So we start in 2000. We start with a sample of all firms which are in the Tokyo Stock Exchange first and second sections. It's about 2,200 firms, and we add back all the firms that got delisted over the 4 years. For example, Kanibo would not have existed in 2008. So in some sense, you can think of this as going back and creating a sample of firms that existed in 2004 and start looking at them going forward. This involved quite, both of us don't speak or read, or we're not fluent in the fluency is far from it. We can't begin to understand Japanese. So one of the things that we did find out, because the time series is fairly important in this, there are databases like the WorldScope, and CompuStat, Global Vantage, which does capture auditor data. So one thing we learned is that in trying to do, when time series and the timing of auditor changes is important, these databases aren't really great sources because for any cross-section, they will get it almost right. But if your auditor switched in 2007, for many cases, for more than half the cases, they would have probably captured it in a year or two later. And that was really bad for, that's really bad data for our analysis. So while it was extremely costly to try to figure out how to get for all these firms for about 7 years of data, this was required to be done. So just a caveat for anyone who's trying to use a large database for very precise sort of measurement of auditor changes. One sort of quick descriptive data on the structure of the audit industry in Japan. It's not dissimilar to the structure of audit industry in any country. I would say definitely it's very, very similar to what happens in the US, is that the large audit firms dominate the market. So the big five is about 95% by market cap of the clients. So goes to show sort of the importance of the worries of catastrophic liability or catastrophic events that might kill another big audit firm. And the key thing to note is that 2004 and 2005, 2006, even after PwC sort of disappeared, there isn't much change in what the big three plus the smaller PwC now audit in Japan. The small firms really didn't get any of the business, and we'll talk about it towards the end again. This market, for whatever reason, is really dominated by firms which can, by really the large audit firms, whether they are 5, 4, 3, any number. So that definitely has sort of public policy implications for what happens, the consequences of concentration in the audit industry. So a quick definitions of some of the variables that we use, and this is in an appendix in the paper. Very, very sort of typical measurements: size, growth, leverage. One of the things that we use is overseas interactions, which we measure by foreign ownership. How much do non-Japanese investors own in Japanese companies? How much do these companies sell abroad? So there's sort of a demand for high quality information coming from non-Japanese actors, people who might be used to a different system of auditing, and U.S. listing. We have some earnings management measures there. We're not very happy to use many of these, especially after what you've heard from Peter. We have timeliness of loss recognition. These aren't the sort of the most ideal earnings quality measures. We have them here for obvious reasons, lack of anything else. But let's see how much we can learn from those. First thing we find is basically there isn't a huge amount of difference between the clients that PwC audited and any of the other sort of big clients, big firms audited. There's a marginally significant evidence of lower profitability in dividends, but really not something to learn too much from. So earnings variability is really the only significant variable in multivariate analysis. I think the way we concluded looking at this is there really wasn't much difference between the set of firms that PwC audited compared to what the other big firms audited were. So the first finding, I guess, is PwC wasn't selecting bad clients or wasn't systematically a bad auditor in Japan. So that doesn't really explain the reason that they sort of went out of business. Yes. Just say PwC.
Yes, are PwC clients similar? So the story can be two ways. Is it because PwC is a bad auditor and doesn't do its job very good, makes their clients later more likely to engage in fraud? Or do similar clients, because they know, do clients who want to engage in fraud and they are aware that PwC won't do a good job, so they they select PwC. You see what I mean? Like, does PwC make clients similar later on, or similar clients tend to choose PwC?
It could be could be either of those. Could be could be like PwC is doing a good job with bad clients, and therefore we don't find any difference. It could be either of those. I guess the only thing this tells us is that there is no difference, and honestly, at some level, this is sort of descriptive evidence. This is really not very important, because I don't know if he had found that PwC was systematically a weaker auditor. I guess there could be some justification to say that they deserve to go out of business, but we don't find any difference. So I don't really know.
I think you can still look at the propensity to engage in fraud before choosing PwC, and whether the propensity to engage in fraud post hiring or choosing PwC changed or became similar.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if that is possible to do, it would be a wonderful thing to do. My sense is in Japan, at least pre all these things, you don't find fraud. So there is no, unlike in the US where you have no restatements, and when you have a cozy relationship going on, you really don't have any fraud which is publicized. So the data doesn't exist on time series of fraud that's been going on over time. We could do things like earnings management measures and all that, but given that we are so skeptical of those measures, we'll have to wonder. I mean, we'll have to think about how we would actually implement.
Thanks.
How we would implement the idea. They have it. They have it from 2006 onwards. They have it from 2006 onwards. They don't have it.
So for most of your sample period, you don't have fee data.
We don't have fee data for before these things happened, or even a few years after these things happened.
Okay.
Because that would be very, very useful data to have. I completely agree with I mean, we look for that. It's there for the last 2 years, actually, 07, 08. It's not there for before
But
that.
the other thing also, you haven't mentioned about the audit opinion. Yeah. Do you observe any systematic difference between PwC and other firms?
We will have to collect that. We have not looked at it so far. But
So
that's
you don't
a
have
good,
a
that's a
opinion.
good thought. That's a good suggestion. We can look at auditor opinions,
Okay.
whether going concern or not. Certainly. Okay. I'll try to remember all these things. I thought, since it's getting videotaped, and I really don't have to write down these things. So the only thing worse than listening to yourself present is actually seeing yourself present. So I bet I'm not going to be using those, but I'll definitely try to implement these suggestions. So to give you a quick timeline, this whole process sort of evolved over 2 years. The earliest indication was in April of 2004 that something sort of fishy was going on, and Kanibo announced the fraud investigation. And over time, all the sort of relevant news started coming out. Kanibo's officers were arrested. Chuo's auditors were arrested. And the interesting thing, as I've done this project, as I said, found a lot of interesting people to talk to. One of them was a student in my class. I was teaching valuation this past semester, and she was working for PwC, and her boss was one of the ones who got arrested. So she actually had lots of stories, and we're collecting 3 more variables now because of the things that she was able to tell us. Anyways, it's been fascinating to try to sort of understand the sort of the micro sequence of various things that were happening within the firm. But anyway, so lots of bad stuff was happening. Kanibo, people were getting arrested. Chuo's auditors were getting arrested. And by sort of almost 2 years later, PwC then realized they were sort of in a big mess, sent a team of sort of top audit people to start trying to fix the problem. In the meanwhile, the Financial Services Authority was trying to figure out how to punish PwC. They didn't want to shut them down because that would have meant, you know, another Anderson. So what they did was that they suspended PwC for 2 months, July and August of of 06. Now that date is critical because Japanese firms mostly have their year ends in March, and they have their annual meetings in June, and sort of the next audit process starts sort of July onward. So the weakest work time for auditors in Japan is July and August, because, you know, most of the annual audit is completed by the end of June, and so they sort of wanted to make it as easy as possible for the clients to sort of live through the suspension, and so they announced it in May, gave them, you know, enough time to complete that year's audit, suspended PwC, and allowed them to come back into business. What PwC did at that time was announced that they would create 2 firms. Arata, which in Japanese means, I'm told, a new awakening, or a new dawn, or a new beginning, or something like that. And they said that they would start this new firm, and they would not take everybody. So we're not exactly sure how this selection process worked. Partly it was, you know, the partners that moved to Arata, partly it was, you know, the large international firms that PwC was doing business with around the world. So a combination of factors led to a selection of a few, about 50 or so companies as clients of this new high-quality audit firm called PwC Arata. And Chuo would resume business in September under a new name called Misuzu. And that would have all clients whoever was willing to stay, except those who moved to Arata. So a firm at this point basically had a few choices. You know, it could just decide that they don't want to be with PwC, move to any other large firm or small firm, decide to go with Arata if, you know, PwC or Arata was willing to take them, or just wait it out and start business with Misuzu. and sort of this is one of the cross-sectional variants that helps us understand, you know, which way these firms go and who decided to do what. Over the next few months, there were a couple of other scandals that were revealed with the Misuzu part of PwC, and clients started leaving. By early 07, this other PwC firm, Misuzu, decided that they have to shut down. Clients were leaving, and, you know, it was going to become unviable to continue. And partly they were also concerned about, you know, their staff and their, you know, other partners. So they started negotiating with the other big 3, and you know, a large part of PwC you know, left to join the other big 3 firms. So by the end of 07, PwC in its earlier form had ceased to exist. This number here, 23 points. So basically, if you see for the first 4 or 5 years, you know, very, very normal, very low rates of turnover for the big 4 firms. Similarly, low rates of turnover for PwC. This 90% is when Misuzu decided to stop business. So basically, everybody decides to leave. It's not 100% because there are some sort of year-end issues, because these are fiscal year ends. Not every firm in Japan is March 30th. So, you know, this is not 100%, but if you add another year, that company is gone. Everybody from Misuzu has moved on. The critical story in the paper is this 23%. These are people who moved before it was necessary to move. So so the contrast between these 24% and the other 76%, which did not move until it was inevitable that they had to move out of PwC into some other auditor. So most of the action in the analysis comes from this group of companies that voluntarily left PwC before they had to do so. So the first question is, do clients switch away, and who? If you see in fiscal 2005 when the problem started, Chuo PwC had about 469 clients. You have about 100 short the next year, and that's roughly that 25% that we were talking about. And a year after, we have about 63 clients, most of whom are with Auditor. So the second year is basically people are forced to leave. So again, the key thing is these 100 or so companies which have quit PwC. This is a pretty high rate compared to anything that for example, Lennox found in the UK. And we do a multivariate test to make sure that is because of Chuo's problems and not clients changing their economic structure in any way. So this 23.6% is basically sort of the anchor around which the paper sort of revolves. This is the multivariate version of that 24%. Essentially, the key thing is that in 2006 there is a huge rate of. So this is a logit on auditor changes over the entire time period, 2002 to 2008. What are the factors that drive auditor change? It turns out that the explanatory power of this regression is much more than anything that the auditor change literature has seen in the past. And that's probably driven in large part by the Chuo related companies. It's probably not customary to present tables from somebody else's paper in your presentation, but this is a Weber paper. And just to give you a sense of what the magnitudes were in Germany, they don't present marginal effects, so we can't really tell what the marginal effects were. But if we had to guess based on the coefficients itself, the magnitude is about 10 times more that we are finding in Japan compared to what they found in Germany. But they did also find a big sort of impact, reputational impact, client switching because of reputational impact. We find something in a sort of a much more significant way. Any thoughts, suggestions so far? Yep.
Why calibrate that audited switch model across the entire, basically, population of switches over a lengthy period of time? When I looked at the previous table, I thought the interesting issue was what's different about the 23% of firms that switched in 2006 or 5, whichever it was, the early switches versus the rest. To me, it seemed like the appropriate comparison is between those firms. Are there differences between those firms and the ones that didn't switch that are consistent with a reputation argument? And then the sort of follow-on from that, the sort of follow-on issue is to what extent can we be confident that that 23.6% went because they wanted to, as distinct from in setting up this alternative arrangement, PwC basically pushed them into that arrangement because, for example, if they had been, say, their largest clients and the ones with the most significant operations outside Japan, they were the ones that may have needed, in effect, or may have had the greatest requirement to continue with PwC because PwC obviously would be doing the subsidiary audits all around the world.
Yeah, those are both extremely valid points. So, I mean, you're much more familiar with the audit literature. I'm trying to get familiar with the audit literature. The reason we did that is because of this sense that we get from the audit literature that, based on some of the earlier papers, that really there isn't much switching when auditors are found to have problems. And that's the reason we're actually first calibrating and showing that there does seem to be a sort of a reputational impact, and it's just not because of, I mean, in that sense, the univariate is enough. It's 24% is large enough to think that, why do a multivariate on that? This is sort of just closing out the loop and appealing, and sort of appealing to this past literature that, or rather sort of counteracting this past literature, which seems to suggest that it doesn't matter what the auditor does, the clients will continue to stick with them. That leads to the second question that you asked, because in most cases, let's take all these sort of Anderson problems, the Baptist Foundation and all that in 1997, 98. Clients didn't switch out of Anderson. In some sense, PwC's actions forced, if there's sort of a pooling going on between good clients and bad clients, the bad clients can take on a good auditor and then pretend to be like the good clients. PwC's actions have forced firms to now choose what they have to do. They don't have the option like Anderson's clients had after Baptist Foundation problems. Just stick with Anderson and pretend nothing. They don't need to. They don't need to switch. PwC, because of forcing companies to choose, have them sort of reveal their demand for high or low quality auditing. So PwC's actions are critical, actually, to the setup of trying to understand who wants it or not. So and that's what we'll do next. Try to figure out who's moving first, who's moving later. Some of the things that we have not done, which we plan to be doing. First of all, a large value that audit firms add in different countries is for companies, let's say, large U.S. multinationals who have Japanese operations. So it could be one possible test to understand auditor reputation is also look at reaction to companies like maybe GM or GE or IBM and other. I don't know who their auditors are, but Pricewaterhouse clients in the U.S. or the U.K. If you can find out what extent of business they have in Japan using segment disclosures and all that, how do you what's the reaction? That will be a very sort of different way of looking at the problem. The other thing to get more directly is to nail down timing of when these firms announce their switches. So what you've seen here so far is just annual data. So you have 2006, 2007, but during the year, a number of things have happened. And the advantage in Japan is actually that, like in the U.S., where firms have to file their 8Ks to tell you when an auditor switches and what the reason is, in Japan you have to do that as well. The problem is that it is in a language that we don't understand, but since we have collected all this, we have some resources now to do that as well. So we are in the process of actually getting the actual timing data. So the timing, I think, will actually tell us whether it was their choice, whether they were forced to do it because PwC decided not to take them with errata, when in the entire year did this process actually unfold. That's yet to come. We don't even have the data yet. No analysis for sure.
Given that the financing structure is so different in Japan, so what is not clear to me is whether Japanese companies have incentive to have high quality audit, and whether these incentives have been changed during your sample period, right? Because of the reform introduced, probably create a demand for high quality audit. This can trigger your findings, right? It will have implications for the interpretation of your results. I don't know whether you take it into account.
So what do you think?
Like the voluntary, the early switches, later switches, right? And very likely, at that time, the demand for high quality audit is not that strong, not rewarded, right? And even that the reputation is damaged, so I don't care, right? So your story is about reputation, but very likely it's about incentive for high quality audit, right? It's kind of like complicated in that sense.
Yes, I mean to the extent that the Japanese financial system is different from other countries. it certainly would be. I guess the interesting thing is even then, there seems to be some demand for high quality auditing. But I see your point.
I kind of follow on Shijaz's question. So the basic question you try to address in this study is whether auditor reputation matters in the sense that more reputable auditor is associated with a higher quality audit. Is that correct? Is that what you're trying to show in the case of Japan?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, if the auditors reveal to be poorer type or poorer quality, will clients do anything about it?
Right. So my question is that, in a sense, you're trying to examine whether reputation matters in the case of Japan.
Correct.
So what's the alternative argument that would suggest the answer would be no? In other words,
why should it not matter?
Would you expect it matters? It should matter, and what otherwise, what other arguments would suggest?
Well, one argument is what he just told us, that the Japanese
incentive.
financial system is such that external financial reporting, there's really not much demand. So how does it matter who your auditor is? So just that would be one of the reasons that will make you believe that you should not find any value for reputation. And there are other sort of prior papers. In fact, that was the reason for the question that was asked earlier, why are you calibrating? Is that there are papers which are found before that there is no demand and clients don't switch at all. and the reason is clients don't care about audit quality. So there is a tension sort of in the in sort of incentives of clients to demand high quality auditing. Personally, if you would ask me, I would have said, of course, if the auditor turns out to be a bad type, why would clients stick with them? Why did you start having auditors in the first place? When the East India Company and the Hudson Bay Company were formed, investors were sitting in UK, and the investments were being made in India and Canada. You needed people to go and verify, and if the people who are verifying are bad, you wouldn't want to have them as auditors anymore. So my prior would have been, of course, there has to be switching, but there's been evidence in the past that there has been no switching, and that is why we calibrated, and that's why these results are actually, I guess, important in the sense that they confirm our belief that this should be an important thing.
Basically, on average, based on your sample, reputation matters in a sense it's associated with the auditor quality.
That is my conclusion, based on sort of the results out there. If you have an alternative interpretation,
the conclusion is kind of obvious, and also in a sense, there's no viable alternative explanation.
Well, I just gave you. He gave you a couple of viable.
Right. The second question is that, given the other studies, and you argue this particular setting, but what new actually we learn from this particular setting beyond what has been documented? Let's say the Weber's paper, they look at it in Germany. It would be nice if you can articulate it a little bit more to help readers to appreciate the contribution of this study.
We'll definitely do that in next version, sure. Amma?
I think it might be also interesting if you can use the duration model, Cox proportional model, to model how quickly the client leaves the auditor. And you can use as a start event 1 here as the clock time. But the nice thing really about your data is that you can change the clock, because the later the event, the severe should be the impact. So it's
definitely. Once we have the timing on exactly when in this whole process, which month, and we will certainly have some hazard rate model to model that. That certainly should be the way we should do it.
but it can be by like it has to be the exact date, or it can be the year of just quitting.
Well, year is so crude that it'll be hard to do a hazard rate model with that. But once we have the timing data, that certainly will be the way to go. I agree.
Time for one more question, maybe two.
And 10 more slides.
Very, very quick question. Out of interest, does the K-RITS structure have any bearing on these switches?
It should, because
clustering.
it should, because what we've noticed is most of these firms within the group will have the same auditor. So if one of them switches, everybody might sort of switch along with that. So one thing we have to do is sort of introduce some variable which will capture whether these firms are the same group. My thought would be to agree with you certainly on that.
Well,
We have the Japanese expert.
Yeah, I'm the only one from Japan. Well, well, I'm not sure about the data in your firm switched to another audit firm before fiscal 27. That includes observation of 114 firms. I have no idea about the content of it, but I can tell you that switch to Auditor, and Sony and Toyota, very good phone, very good company, and worldwide known, and they are listed in US, and then they file financial report under SEC regulation. So that's the reason why they switch to Auditor. And well, NTT and Nippon Steel, they are very good Japanese firm, and then follow the Japanese GAAP. So that's the reason why they stay with the Chuo Aoyama. So, well, in Japan, they try to look at leader and who goes where, and then try to follow. So
I agree with you. I mean, that's the reason why, when we get to the cross-sectional analysis, we will try to figure out, who's listed in the U.S. and that turns out
well, I can tell you there are 34 firms. They are allowed to file.
This basically supports what you're saying. Is when we start looking at cross-sectional, who switches to whom, and what determines that. So we do it as a sort of a three classifications. You go to Arata, you go to anybody else, or you stick with Chuo, and we rank these as you're the best if you go to Arata, 2 if you go to Arata, 1 if you switch to somebody else, and 0 if you stay with the Misuzu. The largest firms go to Arata. The ones with greater foreign ownership, the ones with greater overseas sales, and the ones with U.S. listings tend not to stay with Misuzu. Either they move to Arata or go to some other big firm. So that's completely consistent with your intuition on how they should be switching, and sort of this analysis supports that. The same thing in a multivariate setting. So in the univariate, you find that there is some impact of the ones with more sort of demand from foreign investors or foreign customers and U.S. listing are less likely to stay with the lower quality PwC part. Once you get to the multivariate part, this is I know I've run a number of regressions and seen a number of tables before. The one with the least number of significant coefficients, this takes the cake. Everything is subsumed by size. Okay, so this is an ordered logit. Everything is all the foreign listing, all the the U.S. listing, all the exports, foreign ownership. Everything else just gets taken over by size. Really, the only significant variable is size and market to book. So the larger firms and the more growth-oriented firms go to the better auditor, have a higher demand for auditing. Everybody else seems to stay. We are sort of working on refining. This is the ordered logit. Maybe the decision here. The decision is modeled as 210, which means at any given point, at that point, they had a choice of going to Arata, Misuzu, or some other auditor. Maybe the decision is much more nested. Maybe it was, do I decide to switch or not? If I decide to switch, I have this option. If I decide not to switch, I have to stay with an Arata or Misuzu. So you could think of the decision being a sort of a nested or two-step thing. And if that's the way the decision actually took place, this is not the right regression to run. So we're trying to think about what alternative econometric specification would be possible. Bin? I read your mind, but no, that certainly is a that certainly would be a concern with this, and especially we'd like to have more stars up there. But I mean that's why. So and this it's not I was being a little facetious saying that to separate out sort of the insurance and reputational rationales. I think it's important to try to get at sort of the idea he was talking about. The companies which are listed in the U.S. have sort of litigation risk attached to them. And to the extent that we are, these are all sort of highly correlated with size. If we can separate out the effect of size and effect of other things, that will help us sort of understand the insurance and reputational rationale some more. So, but Ben, if you have, we know that this is not this could be refined, but we don't know exactly what to refine it to. So, if you have thoughts on what the alternative should be, I'll really appreciate that. Yeah.
There's lots of stuff in marketing. Obviously, the two areas are marketing and transport economics that come to mind in terms of those nested choices. But
okay.
I guess the applicability of that depends a lot on something I didn't kind of really understand, which is if you think of what PwC appeared to have done, which was to create two firms, let's call them the A firm and the B firm, I guess the applicability of those sorts of models is a function of whether or not the initial choices stay with PwC or go, and then if you stay with PwC, are you with PwCA or PwCB? And I guess, so the applicability of that stuff really depends on the level of detail that you can provide about whether or not the B firm really was PwCB or was really a kind of almost a cast-off, I guess. And I guess that's just a question of how much institutional detail you can find out.
Okay, yeah, you're right. I mean, this modeling this is going to depend exactly on knowing, what that decision process was, and I'm not confident we know that correctly as yet. So we've done sort of the obvious first pass at this. So to sort of the one of the questions that we were trying to ask here was what happens when one of the big four shuts down. Basically, nothing much happens. The other three take it over. The small firms really aren't substitute for the larger ones. So to the extent this has sort of policy implications in other parts of the world which still have four and are wondering what to do about liability claims, this basically says that the smaller firms aren't going to be much of a factor if any of the big four have to shut down. We also do an event study analysis. Since there is lack of time and lack of results, we will run through this. One of the differences, and so this sort of how do you understand auditor reputation? Some studies find no switching, but market reaction. Some studies find switching, but no market reaction, and that's I guess collectively the group of papers have to tell us something. One of the things here is that event study is really not a very helpful way of trying to understand. We know that about a quarter of the firms switched, but there doesn't seem to have been any demand or any sort of investor reaction to the events that led to PwC's problems. So we had we found 13 different events which we thought were significant in the process. None of them have a strong market reaction. Cumulatively, there is sort of a negative 0.14 with a t-stat of minus 1.9, but we don't want to hang too much. We don't want to hang our hat on that kind of a statistic. What does happen though is on each of these days there is a huge reaction to the overall Japanese market. The index reacts quite negatively. So one possibility is that this wasn't seen as a PwC localized event. It's just a reflection of how accounting was being done and market sort of revision of the quality of accounting for all companies, especially given the earlier results that PwC's clients were no different from anybody else. It's just bad luck that one of them got nailed. It's just a sort of a common effect. It might be that, but to the extent that we can't really we can't know what it was. there is really no effect for PwC itself. So we also plotted it to see whether we were really missing the dates and all the action was before 2003. Everybody already knew, or in early 2004, everybody already knew. So this is the difference between PwC clients and other companies in Japan. And really, there isn't much. There's a little bit you can see in parts that where significant events happened. Maybe we didn't get the right dates, or there was a lot of leakage of information before. So graphically, there is some sense that in the two important time periods where stuff was going on, there is sort of negative trends. But again, this is not something we can really conclude anything from. Sort of descriptive stuff. It's possible that the dates we have are wrong. It's possible that Chuo had problems before and the market had already reacted. So we don't know what to interpret the lack of market reaction tests really. So there's sort of little doubt from PwC's point of view that this was a big deal. They have adopted a strategy in a huge market, which is completely different from any of the big firms' approach in any of the sort of large audit markets. It has lost a huge part of its business in Japan. There is evidence that companies are switching out. Once we have more timing information, we can have a better sense of when exactly in the process who switched out. But it just, at least sort of on the univariate basis, on the multivariate basis, the larger firms which have a demand for audit quality. But if we can tease out some other things, the likely candidates are the ones which have demand from foreign investors, foreign suppliers, and growth companies are the ones which might have a greater demand. On the other hand, there is very little evidence that investors demanded it. There was no stock price reaction. And one public policy thing is about what happens when 4 become 3. The most interesting thing is 6 months ago, 5 months ago, PwC had a huge scandal in India with Satyam Computers. Very, very similar to what happened in Japan. And one of the things they supposedly had done after Japan is cleaned house around the world. So whenever you have these sort of ex post penalties will provide ex ante incentives, which is what sort of reputation is all about, you have to wonder if they've learned anything, because it doesn't seem to have given them any sort of ex ante incentives to prevent another serious problem in India. So what does it mean for audit firms' internal controls? That's how much I have for today. Thank you very much.